Some tragedies fade with time, but others leave scars that never heal. On a quiet September night in 2009, a family of 6 settled into their routine. The children were tucked into bed. A peaceful night was supposed to follow. But before sunrise, their home was turned into a bloodbath. A man with sinister intentions broke in, and what followed was a massacre so brutal that it would forever be known as the Night of Terror in Willow Creek. Even the most seasoned investigators were shaken by what they found inside. And soon, you'll understand why. This story takes us to Willow Creek, a tiny town in rural Missouri, about 200 miles from St. Louis. With just under 300 residents, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Surrounded by rolling fields, thick forests, and old barns, it looked like a postcard of small-town America. But behind that peaceful facade was a crime that would shatter the community forever. At the center of it all were 2 families. The Callahan family, 2 households tied together by love, hardships, and the tragic night that would change everything. Meet Rick Goodwin, a man who built his own future. Rick Goodwin was a hardworking man with a never-give-up attitude. Early in his career, he worked under his stepfather's construction company in Jefferson City, the closest major town where locals went for groceries, hardware supplies, doctor's visits. Rick's stepfather, Paul, and his mother, Judy, had built a strong reputation in the area, and for years, Rick followed in their footsteps. But he had bigger dreams. By the time he was in his early 30s, he had saved up enough money to buy his own property on the outskirts of Willow Creek. It wasn't much at first, just a modest ranch-style home with a detached garage and an above-ground pool. But to Rick, it was his kingdom. He wanted more than just a paycheck. He wanted to be his own boss. And so, he started Goodwin Construction, a small business that quickly became the go-to for remodeling, roofing, and home repair. A chance encounter that changed everything. Running a business was expensive, so Rick made a practical decision. He rented out a room in his home. That's when he met Ruth Callahan, a single mother of 2 who was looking for a fresh start. At first, she was just his tenant, but soon, sparks began to fly. Ruth was warm, funny, and full of life, the kind of person who lit up a room. Rick had always been reserved, but around Ruth he felt different. Before long, their relationship turned romantic, and in 1997, they tied the knot. Rick was 34. Ruth was 27. Their blended family was now complete. Justina, 3, and Dylan, 1. Ruth's kids from a previous relationship. Austin, born in 1998, their first child together. Jessica, born in 1999, their youngest daughter. It was a full house, filled with laughter, love, and the chaos of raising 4 kids. At least, that's how it seemed on the surface. Like any family, the Goodwins had their fair share of struggles. Their youngest daughter, Jessica, was born with a severe neurological condition that required constant care. Their small town didn't have the medical resources to give her the treatment she needed. So, Jessica was moved to a care facility in Springfield, Missouri, 50 miles away. Rick and Ruth visited her often, but the separation was heartbreaking. Sadly, before the night of the massacre, Jessica had already passed away, leaving behind a deep wound in the family. Meanwhile, their son Dylan was showing signs of trouble. Relatives described him as full of energy, constantly acting out, and struggling in school. His teachers sent home behavior reports weekly, and eventually he was diagnosed with ADHD. His parents tried therapy, but it only helped so much. And just when things were already overwhelming, something unexpected happened. Rick's eldest daughter, Nicole, turned 18 and started dating a local man named Christopher Harris. At first, he seemed like the perfect guy. He was 21, well-mannered, and came from a respected family. Their relationship progressed quickly, and before long, they were married. They even moved into a house just a minute away from Rick's home. But what no one knew at the time was that Christopher Harris would soon become the key figure in a horrific crime that would shake this town to its core. When Nicole and Chris welcomed their second baby in July 2009, it was supposed to be a time of joy. Rick and Ruth were thrilled to be grandparents. Nicole and Chris would often drop off their children at Ruth's house while they worked, knowing that their little ones were in good hands. To everyone on the outside, They seemed like the perfect family. No one could have predicted that, in just a few weeks, everything would be torn apart in the most horrific way imaginable. It started like any ordinary September morning in Willow Creek. 10-year-old Sam Landstrom had just gotten a new bike and was eager to show it off. He pedaled down the dirt roads, heading to the Goodwin house, the place where he always found kindness, laughter, and maybe even a snack or two. But as he reached the front porch, something stopped him in his tracks. The door was slightly open, and smeared across the wood, the handle, and the steps was blood. Sam's heart pounded. He had never seen anything like this before. Terrified, he turned and rode as fast as he could, straight to Nicole's house, where Rick's stepfather, Paul Pudge, had spent the night. As soon as Pudge and his grandson, Adam, heard Sam's breathless story, they rushed to the house. Adam was the first to step onto the porch. He noticed the bloodstains, and then he saw it, a knife, lying at the bottom of the porch steps. A chill ran through him. Slowly, Adam pushed open the door and reached for the light switch. The moment the room illuminated, his stomach twisted. Lying in the hallway, in a pool of blood 2 to 3 feet wide, was Rick Goodwin. His body was battered, his head nearly unrecognizable. Adam froze. His entire body screamed run. And that's exactly what he did. He turned on his heel, raced outside, and told Pudge, "Call 911. When the police arrived, they didn't know what to expect. But what they found inside the house would haunt them forever. The walls were damaged, as if someone had smashed their fists or a weapon into them. It was clear that whoever had done this was filled with pure rage. Then they found the second victim, just outside the main bedroom, curled up on the floor, wearing nothing but shorts, was 14-year-old Dylan. His injuries were just as brutal as Rick's. Blood covered the ceiling, the floor, the furniture. This wasn't just a murder. This was a massacre, and it was far from over. As officers moved through the house, their worst fears were confirmed. In the master bedroom, Ruth lay lifeless on the floor, still wearing her nightgown. In the attached bathroom, they found 11-year-old Austin, collapsed on the tile, his body motionless and covered in blood. It was clear they had all been caught off guard. They had no time to fight back. The killer had struck when they were at their most vulnerable. But the horror wasn't over yet. Walking down the blood-soaked hallway, officers entered 16-year-old Justina's room. And what they saw made them stop in their tracks. Blood was everywhere. It soaked into the bed, the walls, the floor. Justina was lying on her stomach, head hanging over the edge of the bed. Beneath her, a puddle of brain matter spread across the floor. Her injuries were worse than anyone else's, as if the killer had saved the most brutal attack for her. The officers barely had time to process the horror before they made one final discovery. And this one would break them completely. In a small adjacent room, the officers at first thought it was empty. But then they saw a shape in the dark closet. A tiny, crumpled body. A 3-year-old girl. Her skin peeled back above her right ear. Her small frame surrounded by blood. The room fell silent. Even the most experienced officers couldn't hold back their tears. But then, something moved. One of the paramedics gasped. The child, she was still alive. In an instant, a first responder rushed forward, scooping her up like a baby. He ran through the house, out the door, and toward the ambulance waiting outside. There was one small hope in the middle of this unspeakable tragedy. But who had done this? And why? The answers were coming, and they were darker than anyone could have ever imagined. As the ambulance sped through the dark highways, sirens wailing, the paramedics inside fought desperately to keep little Tabitha alive. Her vital signs were weak, but she was still fighting. When they arrived at the nearest trauma center, doctors immediately knew her condition was critical. Her skull was fractured, and severe brain swelling was threatening her life. Meanwhile, back at the crime scene, Chris Callahan, Nicole's husband, had just arrived. He had been called from work and rushed over, unaware that his world was about to collapse. When police confirmed the unthinkable, that the entire Goodwin family had been murdered, Chris stood there, silent. Then, they told him one more thing. Tabitha had survived. At that moment, everyone felt a small glimmer of relief. A survivor meant hope. Hope that they could find out who did this. But for Chris, It meant something else entirely. Without saying a word, he jumped back into his truck and sped off toward the hospital. While Chris raced down the highway, investigators remained at the Goodwin home, trying to piece together the nightmare that had unfolded inside. Among the first to respond were Logan County Sheriff's Corporal Michael Block, Missouri State Trooper Paul Hennessy. What they found inside the house was beyond comprehension. But even in the blood-soaked chaos, there were clues. A bloody handprint on the bathroom vanity, where young Austin had been killed. A fresh shoe print outside, matching a K-Swiss tennis shoe. A neighbor's tip. They had seen a silver pickup truck passing by around the time of the murders, with exhaust pipes sticking up through the truck bed. But despite these pieces of the puzzle, the case was far from solved. That night, Dr. John Ralston, a forensic pathologist, began autopsies on the victims. It didn't take long to realize something horrifying. These weren't gunshot wounds. At first, officers thought a shotgun had been used, given the severe head trauma. But the truth was even worse. Each victim had been beaten to death, bludgeoned with a level of brutality rarely seen, even by seasoned forensic experts. Here's what they found. Rick Goodwin, the father, had 39 impact wounds, 13 of them to his head. Ruth Goodwin, the mother, suffered 28 blows, her skull shattered beyond recognition. 11-year-old Austin was hit at least 21 times, his feet stomped on, and his head crushed against hard objects. 14-year-old Dylan suffered more than 100 injuries, with at least 52 direct blows to his body. 16-year-old Justina had 15 identifiable injuries, but was missing the top part of her skull. It was clear. This wasn't just a murder. It was rage. It was personal, and whoever did it wanted them to suffer. Meanwhile, at the hospital, doctors faced an uphill battle trying to keep Tabitha alive. Her skull was fractured in multiple places. Her brain was swelling rapidly. She was unable to speak, unable to see because of the swelling. But she could move one arm. It was a small sign, but it meant she was still fighting. To help her survive, doctors made a painful decision. They had to remove parts of her skull to relieve the pressure. It was her only chance. Through it all, Nicole never left her side. She sat beside her unconscious daughter, whispering soft reassurances, holding her tiny hand. But despite the pain and uncertainty, there was one thing everyone knew. If Tabitha woke up, she might be able to name the killer. And that meant she was in danger. Police officers stood guard outside her hospital room, ready for the possibility that the murderer might return to silence her. Meanwhile, Chris had finally arrived at the hospital. But something about his behavior stood out. Instead of being relieved that Tabitha was alive, he seemed nervous. He hovered near her room. He avoided eye contact with officers. And when doctors discussed her condition, he barely reacted. He spent hours with Nicole, pretending to offer support. But something about him just didn't feel right. Nicole and Chris's relationship had been rocky. They had broken up multiple times. There were rumors of arguments, financial stress, and secrets. Nicole had been unhappy for months. Now, with the entire Goodwin family dead, something felt even more off. What was Chris so afraid of? What was he hiding? And why did he rush to the hospital the moment he found out Tabitha had survived? Was it guilt or fear? Days passed. The police were running out of leads. Despite investigating the silver pickup truck, the bloody handprint, and the shoe print at the scene, they still had no official suspect. The Goodwin family had no known enemies. They were well-liked, generous, and financially comfortable, a family that embodied the American dream. But now, that dream had been shattered. The police warned the entire town to stay vigilant. Lock your doors. Keep track of your children. Watch out for your neighbors. No one knew if or when the killer would strike again. Then a week later, something unexpected happened. Something that would change the entire course of the investigation. It was a quiet afternoon at the hospital where Tabitha was still fighting for her life. An officer, just finishing his shift of guarding her hospital room, stepped into the elevator. Standing next to him was Chris Callahan, Nicole's husband. He had just left Tabitha's room. But the officer wasn't looking at Chris's face. He was looking at his shoes. K-Swiss sneakers, with an aggressive tread. The same kind of shoe print found outside the Goodwin home. The officer didn't hesitate. He called it in immediately. Detectives quickly pulled Chris in for questioning. They took his shoes and compared the soles to the crime scene footprint. There was one problem. Chris's shoes were half a size too big. But detectives weren't convinced this was enough to clear him. So they took fingerprints and palm prints and sent them to the crime lab. Then Chris's brother, Jason Callahan, stepped in. He swore Chris couldn't have done it. He claimed they had been together all night, miles away from Willow Creek, nowhere near where the murders happened. But the investigation was far from over. And soon, Jason himself would be caught in a web of lies. Nicole was furious at the mere suggestion that Chris could be involved. She took to social media, posting an emotional message on MySpace. This whole situation is such a mess and so unfair. Not only have my children lost 5 close family members, but now their daddy is being set up and taken away. This is too much to bear. She continued, passionately defending Chris. There's solid evidence that all 6 victims fought for their lives. And Chris doesn't even have a scratch on him. He's been with us through everything, and now they've taken him too. Nicole wasn't the only one standing by Chris's side. His stepmother, Debbie Callahan, told the media that their family believed in his innocence. His father, Ed Callahan, broke down in tears during a phone call with Chris in jail. Chris was terrified. "Dad, I'm scared," Chris told him, "because I know the killers are still out there." But were they? Or was the real killer closer than anyone thought? Chris shows no signs of a struggle. But then, when police booked Chris, they took photographs of his entire body. They expected to find defensive wounds, scratches, or bruises. Instead, they found nothing. But there was one thing that stood out: a large blister on the palm of his right hand. It meant he had been gripping something tightly. Coincidentally, just a few miles away, a tire iron was discovered in a creek near Jason's house. And investigators were starting to believe that Chris and Jason weren't telling the truth. The police soon seized Chris's truck, but it didn't belong to him. It was registered to Jason's girlfriend, Jennifer Everett. Jennifer and her mother, Sarah Duncan, had provided alibis for Chris and Jason on the night of the murders. They claimed the brothers were with them all night. But as police dug deeper, those alibis began to fall apart. And soon, Jennifer and Sarah were arrested for obstruction of justice. Then a new witness came forward, and her story changed everything. A woman named Lori Cole, an armed security guard, came forward with a shocking statement. She told police that, at 11:35 p.m., on the night of the murders, Chris and Jason Callahan had knocked on her door. They asked if she wanted to party. Lori lived just minutes away from the Goodwin home. At the time, she thought nothing of it. But now, she realized that the timing was suspicious. The murders happened sometime between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Chris and Jason had no reason to be knocking on her door at that hour, unless they were looking for somewhere to go after committing an unspeakable crime. Chris was no longer just a suspect. Now he was the prime suspect, and his brother, Jason, was looking more suspicious than ever. The police had a bloody handprint, a matching shoe print, and a broken alibi. It was only a matter of time before the truth unraveled completely. And when it did, the town of Willow Creek would never be the same. As the investigation closed in on the Callahan brothers, more and more people started coming forward. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle, and the picture that emerged was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. First, there was Lori Cole, the armed security guard. She had told police that on the night of the murders, around 11:35 p.m., Chris and Jason Callahan had knocked on her door. They asked if she wanted to party. She refused, but something about them fell off. They had already been drinking and using drugs, and they didn't seem to want the night to end. She also noticed a Ford Ranger parked outside, one that looked eerily similar to the one Chris and Jason had been driving earlier that night. Then there was Christy Moore, a woman who had been in an on-again, off-again relationship with Chris. She told police that Chris had called her late that night, but she was busy with her kids and couldn't meet up. Instead, she agreed to see him the next morning. Just 12 hours after the murders, Chris arrived at Christy's house. And what happened next sent a shiver down investigators' spines. They slept together. Then, Christy took selfies of the two of them in bed. In the pictures, Chris was smiling, kissing her, and acting completely normal. Not a single sign that just hours before, He had been inside a house covered in blood, slaughtering an entire family. Christie also told investigators that Chris had no visible injuries or marks on his body. Nothing seemed off, except one thing. She hadn't seen him in 2 months, likely because he had just had a baby with Nicole. Chris denied everything. He swore he had nothing to do with the murders. But when police confronted him with the fingerprint evidence, Chris did something that changed everything. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right and lawyered up. The moment the case was going to trial, Chris had nothing left to say. But his brother Jason? Jason wasn't willing to go down with him. At first, Jason had only been charged with obstruction of justice. But as the investigation intensified, his charges were upgraded to 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Now facing the possibility of life in prison, Jason had a choice to make: stay silent and protect his brother, or tell the truth and save himself. His survival instinct kicked in, and Jason began to talk. According to Jason, the night started with drugs and alcohol. He and Chris had been out partying, drinking, and snorting cocaine. Eventually, they decided they needed female company. They first tried to call some ex-girlfriends, but both women turned them down. That should have been the end of it. But Chris was high, drunk, and restless, and he wasn't done for the night. So, they kept searching until their search led them to the Goodwin home. Jason told 13 different versions of what happened next, but one detail remained the same. Chris killed the Goodwin family. Jason claimed that it was Chris's idea to go to the house, and that his reason was disturbing. Chris had convinced himself that 16-year-old Justina Goodwin had been flirting with him. He believed she was interested in him. Whether or not they planned for it to be consensual remains unknown. But Jason swore that Chris was fixated on Justina. Jason said he stayed in the truck while Chris approached the house. In some versions of his story, Chris was already armed with a tire iron. In others, he went to the door without it. But in every version, what happened next was the same. Rick Goodwin, the father, answered the door. After a brief conversation, things escalated. Chris retrieved the tire iron from the truck. And then, Jason heard screams and thumping sounds. The horror had begun. Jason claimed he sat in the truck as he listened to the chaos inside the house. He heard loud thuds, screams. Then, he saw 14-year-old Dylan jump out of a bedroom window. Dylan ran to the front door, then ran back inside. Seconds later, Dylan burst out of the house again. He was running for his life. What happened next was a blur of violence and horror. Jason's story changed too many times to know the full truth. But one thing was clear. The Callahan brothers had just wiped out an entire family. And now, the walls were closing in on them. The case against Christopher Harris was airtight. The evidence, the testimonies, and the sheer brutality of the crime left no room for doubt. And yet, the darkest revelations were still to come. The final moments of the G family. According to Jason Callahan's confession, he saw his brother chase Dylan Goodwin outside. Dylan was bleeding badly, but despite his injuries, he kept fighting. Jason watched in horror as Chris struck Dylan repeatedly with the tire iron, 5 or 6 times. Then, as if nothing had happened, Chris simply walked back inside. Miraculously, Dylan got back on his feet and ran back into the house. But he wouldn't survive the second time. Minutes later, Jason saw Chris return to the truck, his clothes soaked in blood. Without a word, he hopped into the driver's seat, tossed his shoes and the murder weapon out the window, and drove away into the night. It was just another night for Christopher Harris. One of the most disturbing elements of this case was the motive. There had been a previous complaint of attempted sexual assault against Christopher Harris. The victim? 16-year-old Justina Goodwin. The complaint had been dropped just 1 week before the murders. Jason later suggested that Chris's real motive that night was sexual in nature. And when his plans didn't go the way he intended, he snapped. Investigators retraced Jason's testimony, searching the exact locations he described. And what they found confirmed everything. In a ditch beside the road, officers recovered the K-Swiss sneakers and the blood-stained tire iron. Forensic tests didn't lie. The DNA on the shoes and weapon matched Christopher Harris and the Goodwin family. The jury's decision. On May 31, 2013, After weeks of testimony, the jury delivered its verdict. Christopher Harris was guilty. 5 consecutive life sentences for the murder of the Goodwin family. 30 years for the attempted murder of Tabitha Goodwin. 30 years for home invasion. 20 years for robbery. During the trial, Chris's defense team tried one last desperate attempt to save him. They argued that Dylan Goodwin was the real killer, and that Chris had only killed Dylan in self-defense. But that didn't hold up for a second. The evidence was overwhelming. Chris had planned the attack, and now he would never walk free again. In 2013, right before his sentencing, Chris's legal team requested a retrial. It was denied. Then, in 2019, they filed an appeal with the Illinois 4th District Appellate Court. That, too, was denied. No matter how many times he tried, Christopher Harris was never getting out. But if you thought the story ended there, you'd be wrong. Years after the trial, a former cellmate of Chris stepped forward. What he had to say shocked even the most hardened investigators. According to the cellmate, Chris bragged about the murders. He felt no guilt, no remorse. His only regret? Not burning down the house that night. If he had, he said, no one would have ever known he was responsible. Chris thought he was untouchable. But in the end, justice caught up to him. Nicole turns on Chris. Throughout the trial, one of the biggest questions was how Nicole Goodwin, Chris's wife and the daughter of one of the victims, would react. At first, she stood by his side. She defended him on social media. She refused to believe he was capable of such horrific violence. But as the evidence piled up, Nicole's loyalty crumbled. By the time of Chris's sentencing, she hated him. She went from defending him to cursing him. Because no matter how much she loved him, he had slaughtered her family. During the sentencing, one voice stood out among all the others. Tabitha Goodwin, the only survivor of the massacre. She was just 7 years old at the time of the attack. But her words hit harder than any lawyer, judge, or prosecutor. She looked straight at Christopher Harris and said, "I am 7, and it still breaks my heart. I wish you were dead and my brothers, sister, mommy, and daddy were alive. You don't sneak up on people like that. You have to say sorry, because do you know how badly that broke my heart?" Her words brought the courtroom to tears. But Chris? He showed no emotion. What happened to Jason? For his role in the murders, Jason Callahan was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Some thought his punishment was too light. After all, he had listened to the murders, he had seen Dylan begging for help, and he had done nothing. But in the end, his testimony was what helped convict Chris. Without it, Chris might have walked free. Despite all the horror she endured, Tabitha Goodwin defied the odds. She survived multiple surgeries. She fought through the nightmares and trauma. And with the help of the police officers who protected her, she slowly started to heal. They even threw her a birthday party, showering her with love and care, the kind she had lost when Chris Harris tore her family apart. In the wake of such unimaginable tragedy, the community came together to Insajee family was never forgotten. A playground was built in honor of Austin, Dylan, and Justina, a place where laughter and joy could thrive, just as they once did. And perhaps, in some way, it was a reminder that evil doesn't get the last word. In 2014, the TV show When Murder Comes to Town aired an episode about the case. But instead of focusing on justice, the show heavily leaned into the defense's argument, suggesting that Dylan was a troubled teen who might have been capable of violence. This outraged those who worked on the case, including law enforcement officers who knew the truth. They released an open letter stating, "Dylan was not just a victim. He was a hero. He fought for his family." And I completely agree. Dylan's actions that night, his bravery, his refusal to give up, deserve to be remembered and honored. What do you think? Now, I want to hear from you. Was justice truly served? Should Jason Callahan, Chris's accomplice, have received a harsher sentence? Does the media have a responsibility to tell the whole truth instead of distorting a case for ratings? Let's discuss it in the comments below. And if you appreciate our deep dives into true crime, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss a case like this. Thank you for watching. Stay safe.